Is he really late?
Open the city council meeting and welcome everyone here. This is our council work session for October 28th. And the first item up, as you know, I gave you a resolution to look at the last meeting. We have.
I guess he's on.
Oh, wait a minute. Does he have to call back?
We might have to reset it.
Oh, good. You're welcome. Could tell I was an AV monitor.
Thank you.
Thanks for suggesting that, Chris.
Well, it's just the volume. The volume shouldn't affect it.
Okay. All right, we'll just go ahead then. And so anyway, I gave you a resolution to look at that we're going to put on the table today. And since then, we have made some changes in that resolution, and you have a fresh copy in front of you. And some of the folks who were at the press conference before this know this, but for those of you who weren't, we amended the language from an earlier draft because we realized that a formal declaration of emergency by the governor would have specific requirements under state law. Such a declaration is meant for use in cases of major national disasters, and the official request can only come from a county after we as a city have exhausted our resources, and then we have gone to the county for assistance, and they've exhausted their resources, and then we would ask the state. So we are not doing that process. So what we're asking is for state government as a whole to treat homelessness situation as a crisis or a real emergency and agrees to work with local governments. So the specifics of the language that is in front of you today is Section 1. The City of Eugene is committed to exploring options for the creation of suitable short-term shelter spaces for the homeless, in addition to the creation of permanent housing options for the homeless. Addressing this issue is urgent in order to aid those in need of shelter. Section 2. The City Council of the City of Eugene joins other governments in acknowledging the crisis that exists with homelessness and housing, and requests that the state treat homelessness as a crisis by A, convening a work group composed of state agencies, local governments, and nonprofit service providers to address this issue, and B, appropriating additional funding for the homelessness and housing crisis. The city manager, at Section 3, the city manager is directed to forward a copy of this resolution to Governor Brown, the President of the Oregon Senate, the Speaker of the Oregon House, and our local state delegation, together with a request that the state take the actions requested in this resolution. So that is what's before you, and I will have Council President put this motion out, and then we'll comments anybody wants to.
Just a question for the city attorney. Is it enough for me to just refer to the resolution title? Okay. So I move for the council to adopt a resolution declaring the urgency of the housing and homelessness crisis and the need for state assistance to address it.
Second.
Moved and seconded. Discussion? Councilor Clark.
I would like to vote in favor for this. There is a sense that I get from day-to-day travels around the city that you are correct in the language that appears in F here that says, and I guess I only got 3 minutes here. I'm going to say as a preamble. The other day, Chris said something that I understood the larger context in which his comment was made, and he was making a point that's different than this. But one of the things he said was that, of course, all of us care about protecting single-family homes because all of us live in single-family homes. But I don't. I live in multifamily housing, and I think I'm the only one at the table that pays rent. So I understand, I think in a very real way, what people who are working for a living and paying rent and facing that stress month to month feel. So my comments aren't without saying, hey, I live there. I'm one of those guys that deals with that, and I get it. But in F, one of the things it says is that the number of homeless individuals appear to be growing rather than shrinking. I seem to want to agree with you based on my perception, but the Lane County statistics say that you're wrong. And so, I mean, when we look at the one-night homeless counts, in 2009 it was about 2,700. 2 years later in 2011 it's 2,100. In 2013 it was 1,700, and this last year it was 1,400. So over 6 years we've about cut the homeless population in half, according to the records that we in Lane County keep. So I'm wondering if I can get something from you that informs that piece where you say that the problem is getting worse. I think our efforts are doing a darn good job at decreasing homelessness in our community. If anybody wants to speak to that, that would help me with voting in favor of this, because I seem to want to, but there are parts of it that are a problem for me. The other piece, I'm glad we took the emergency piece out, because what we're not doing is, with this resolution, is addressing anything in terms of the immediate winter we're facing. All of this is for when the legislature meets and what is dealt with in the next year's session, and then funding cycles that start 2 years from now. It doesn't seem, and that's why I'm hoping to get better educated about your intent here and get more information. If there are things that the state can do to assist us for the course of this winter, that seems more emergency, crisis, and pressing like, rather than dealing with long-term policy trends over time. Thank you.
I've got Chris and then Claire in the queue, and then Alan.
Yeah, in fact, I actually appreciate that question, because I've actually spent several years studying this issue. When I was at United Way, it was an issue that came up all the time, the issue of homelessness and the numbers, and whether it was an indigenous population or a population coming from other places. And I, too, have been familiar with those one-night homeless count figures. And yes, they have gone from a high during the recession of 2,900 people down to the low that it is now. And I think part of what I think the issue is that we're talking about here is the growing number of people who are systemically homeless. Because the recession did represent a huge spike in people who suddenly became homeless, situationally homeless. And they were working to get back on track. And many of the programs, as you pointed out, have been very successful in helping them do that. The last conversation I had with folks over at Human Services was that the average situationally homeless person was 90 to 120 days to get back into a sustainable situation, or at least one that was on the road to sustainability. So really what we're talking about, kind of to the point we've talked about before, is there's that self-sufficiency track, which Human Services helps a lot, and there was a huge spike in that group. Then you have the other group, which includes the stability group, people who, for a host of reasons, are probably not going to find employment. They're probably going to have a very difficult time finding homes through whatever issues that are there. Systemic homelessness, I think, is really the problem that we're trying to address now. And in this case, the numbers of systemically people that get homeless and stay homeless, and we can't really seem to get a handle on the problem, I think those are the numbers that we're seeing either holding steady or growing slightly. That number we're just not getting a handle on. So the overall homeless count has indeed come down. The numbers of the homeless count show it. And it does speak to the success of getting situationally homeless people back into a sustainable situation. But I think what we're trying to do here is say there's another population of people who are extremely difficult to work with. You can't just say we'll get them a cheap apartment and a job and they'll get back on track. A lot of those people are, but there's folks who have mental disabilities, PTSD, drug and alcohol problems, a host of issues that is just going to be extremely difficult to work with them. And I think this is us beginning to try to take a stab at addressing that very, very difficult group. So overall, you're right, but I think within that systemic group, that systemic problem, there's still, I think, work to do. That's my interpretation of what I'm reading here.
And before I call on Claire, the only other comment I would make about that is the longer people are unhoused, the harder it is for them to get back on track, no matter what the circumstances that gets them there, because you're messing with they've got the added difficulty of being unemployed for a longer period of time. It just compounds the challenge for them to get their lives back on track the longer they are out there. So that's just something for your consideration. And I'll do the other thing later. Claire.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate Councillor Clark wanting to make sure we're factual in this statement. I think it's important to remember that the one-night homeless count is just that. It's a snapshot in time of one date that a large group of volunteers tried to get a handle on what might be a typical night of folks who don't have shelter. So it's not... it's important data, but it's not the only measurement of how that is playing out. And I do believe that the Oregon Education Department just released a report that showed a fairly significant increase in the number of K through 12 enrolled students who are experiencing homelessness. And I don't have those figures in front of me, so I can't vouch for whether they were greater or lesser for the Eugene area, but I believe they increased. And I think you can also view this sentence in a more universal term rather than thinking about the defined borders of the municipality of the city of Eugene. I think a message that was conveyed at the press conference we just had was that this is a problem that's beyond our city borders, although it shows up in our city in many, many ways because we are the county seat. So we may, I think, need to think about it in terms of there's a greater need in the state and in the nation, and some of it's going to land here in Eugene locally. And I spoke at that press conference about the need for greater support from the state and even the federal government to address our needs here locally, which currently outstrips our ability to meet that need. And I really support this kind of strong statement coming from this council because I do believe it's one step, an important step, to help us get additional resources, because otherwise we face the situation of taking our current resources, which are already dedicated to supporting folks in need and keeping them from becoming homeless, and possibly redirecting those to new programs. And that's just a choice that I don't think any of us want to face because it's not solving the problem.
Don't know what's causing it.
So getting some musical accompaniment. So in any case, I really do hope this gets unanimous support from the council today.
And I've got Alan and Greg in the queue, and I want to ask, George, did you want to be in the queue?
No, Mayor, but I will support the resolution. I think that it is a crisis, and we need to devote more resources to it. So I will definitely support the resolution. Thank you.
For the second. Yeah,
Thank you, George. All right, Alan.
I too would like to be serenaded by music when I'm speaking.
as long as I get to choose the music, I'll cue that up for you, brother.
Right. Yeah, Darth Vader. I've been working on this homeless issue since I was on Human Resources Commission over 20 years, and I think you make an interesting point, Mike, but I kind of think it misses the point. The homelessness crisis is not going away despite all the significant efforts, and we've done a great deal as is enumerated in the resolution, and we'll continue to do more. But we need to figure this out. We're one of the richest countries in the world, and we have the resources to deal with this, but it's just a matter of priority. What this resolution does is make this a priority. Whether it is a crisis kind of depends on where you sit and what you see. And I, for one, support the intent of this and ratcheting up the pressure on every level of government to try to deal with this problem. We've been neglectful in trying to deal with it for a long, long time. It's not getting much better. And if you, as I have, go talk to the folks that are at Opportunity Village or the rest stops. They're just kind of everyday folks that have landed in this space by a bunch of things conspiring in their circumstances. And unfortunately, an enormous amount of the homeless people are kids. They're children. And that's just not fair to them. their chance of having an opportunity to exceed and excel in our society greatly diminished by being unhoused. So I, for one, support the resolution. I think we need to get better at doing this. I think we need to bring the resources of the state to bear on crafting solutions. We've done some really creative stuff, and there's some lessons to be learned there that may be able to be applicable in other places.
That's your music here. For me.
Greg.
Without the music.
All right. Good.
A couple things I want to address in terms of some of the points that you bring up, Mike. One of the things that we don't consider is the fact that we have a lot of people who are not being counted. We have people who've fallen off the radar screen. We have what we now call the underclass. And it's hard to determine how many people fall into that particular category, but they do surface from time to time to get and access services along the spectrum. And we have a number of people who fall into that category, people who don't necessarily get counted, but they are homeless and they are in some form of distress. The other thing along with that is the number of people who are on the edge of homelessness. So on the other side of being homeless or other side of being in the other class are people who are underemployed and people who, are barely making it. And at any point in time, they lose a paycheck, they lose, hours or whatever. They fall back into this category or fall on the other side of that category. So I think that, trying to kind of capture, the extent or breadth of this is a lot more difficult than what, we currently have structures and infrastructure and process to be able to handle. The other thing that I want to point out too is this, and it's been said by Claire and Alan and Chris and others that, we have a serious problem with homeless youth. I've worked at Lane Community College for over 20 years, and the number of homeless students that I see has grown. And the number of homeless students that I also work with the school districts. So I work with all of the school districts in the metro area and also extended out. And the number of homeless students is increasing at an alarming rate. And so we really need, this is a crisis, and it's beyond the capacity or jurisdictional capacity of the city to really effectively address the crisis. We need the state to step up. And there's another point, too. We need all of our partners in the public sector to step up, and that includes our educational partners. The K through 12s are doing what they can. They have programs, they have staff that are trying to provide resources to folks, and particularly to those students who are unhoused. But there's also the other side of the spectrum, the 16 through 20 spectrum, which would be our colleges and universities. So
I'll second round to you after making a couple comments. Like my comment would be that, Representative Barnhart was here this morning for the press conference, and he was talking about some of the investments the state is making now in affordable housing, and that's really important, but he also recognizes that they need to do much more. But the point that I made this morning is, yes, I think there is a growing focus on affordable housing, and there needs to be, but we also have to address the people who are caught in the homeless state right now, and the state board hasn't really focused in on that, and we're asking them to focus in on that in our resolution here. And so that's an important thing, that if people are, before they can get even into the doorway of affordable housing, a lot of people are spending an incredible amount of time without any kind of help. So we need to be able to step up to this at a different level, and we can't do it on our own. Mike, you can speak now.
Thank you, Mayor. If this resolution, and by the way, I know a lot of the things you were saying there, Greg. Frankly, I live a lot of the things that you were saying, so trust me, I understand. If this resolution, and what I was asking previously was if there's another source of information other than what people experience when they're taking, when they're doing their work in the community and when they're speaking with others. I mean, if there was a statistical sort of place that you were referring to that particular increase in problem. And I take your point too, Claire, that if this said, for example, that it appears to be growing in the state, I'd say, yeah, okay, I can vote for that. I know it is in Portland. I know statistically it is in Portland. I'd be in favor of that. My challenge is with what comes next. Because I, too, want to say, should the state be stepping up? You bet. Do we have vastly insufficient support at the state level for the mentally ill? Yeah, we do. And we need a lot more of it, including housing. There are a number of pieces that I think the state has an appropriate role to take, and they should step up to. And it's long since time. But if this resolution then is used as a reason why, for example, the state should, a couple years hence, increase their budget for affordable housing, I think there's a better solution for folks that need affordable places to live in our community than state increase in affordable housing with public tax dollars. And so I want to vote in favor of this if the message is the state needs to step up to the places where its role is appropriate. We, I, Greg, George, Betty, over time have all said things many times around the need to work together with the county and with the state, and so this falls right in line with that for me. But, for example, Monday we were supposed to talk about workforce housing, and we moved that work session. I think we shouldn't be on this course of tax-subsidized high-rent apartments that we're trying to construct so much as we're trying to focus on building workforce housing that working people can afford to live in. We've moved that work session back again from today to talk more about how do we in our community put a greater focus on creating workforce housing that people can afford to live in. I'm less in favor of the idea of more taxpayer subsidized housing and more creating intelligent housing that working people can afford. So I'm still deciding here, I guess.
Well, I bet you'll be happy for us to vote on this so we can get on to that discussion of workforce housing. My only other comment, Mike, and of course everybody's entitled to their perspectives and so forth, and I would just say if you really want that kind of data, the county does track it, and it's available for everyone. They have statistical information on who's out there and how successful they're being at housing people. They have information on how many people are in that chronically homeless thing. And one of the things that's emerged is because we've had these interim solutions, which are quite wonderful in terms of safe spots and Occupy and those kinds of, not Occupy, Opportunity Village, that those have been very helpful because we didn't have something more to offer. But they don't count as housing, so you end up having people who are being helped in that way be counted as chronically homeless because those do not count as housing by the standards of HUD. So just that little bit of information. Yes.
One more thing, not directly related to this, but since we're talking about homelessness and housing, one of the issues we talked about in the press conference was finding a place in the wintertime for folks to be safe and dry and warm if they can. Buildings is problematic because of fire codes and all of that kind of issues, but having a space where you could put up a tent and create that kind of safe space. Good idea.
Excuse me, Alan. George, there's some...
George, can you mute, please?
We're getting
Yes, Mayor.
we're getting a lot of noise from you. So
I'm so sorry. I'll move.
thank you. Go ahead.
Serenaded by a different kind of sound. Well, I agree that we need to do that and do it in the short term, but I think we actually need to go beyond that. I think we need to think about this in in the intent of this motion, and that it is a crisis, we need to also apply other models of affordable housing models that we have, including our housing dispersal policy, which says that we're going to take affordable housing and spread it around the whole city. No ward in the city or any part of the city is immune from homelessness, nor do any of the constituents that are in any of our wards. We all have homeless folks in them. So I really think that we ought to start thinking about this in terms of using some of the pilots that we've done, especially the Opportunity Village, and use that, which has been tremendously successful, have been great neighbors, and have actually moved people on out of homelessness, and then take that model and try to create it around the city in each of the wards, and figure out where we can have this, as we do with affordable housing, dispersed throughout the entire city, and use that model to work on this problem as well.
Thank you. Now I'm going to, yep, Betty, did you?
I just wanted to say let's vote. I want us to get to the cell phone topic today.
The answer is yes. All those in favor, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in favor and none in opposition. Oh, George.
I vote yes, Mayor.
7 in favor and none in opposition. It passes. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it. And so then, we'll very quickly go into our discussion on workforce housing.
Mayor, I'll turn it over to Denny and Ann to walk us through a presentation.
Thank you. I'm just going to kick this off and then hand it over to Ann. This work session spun out of the MUPTI process, if you recall. We were given direction to hold a work session to discuss workforce housing, and its definition is the direction. But I think really the question isn't its definition. Really, I think the question is, how do we help bring more housing units into the marketplace that's affordable to not only low-income but moderate-income households and families. So today really is an introduction to that conversation. I think you'll find it's going to be a fairly complex issue, and we'll touch on some of that. And generally, we don't really have a lot of answers. We have a lot of questions, and we haven't really done a thorough analysis, again, because it's complex. If you look at the spectrum of housing issues that we are addressing, there's market rate housing. We have policies that direct marketplace housing basically into targeted areas. Downtown is the perfect example. And we use tools like MUPTI to help make that happen. We have affordable housing programs, and for years we've had policies and programs that create rental and ownership housing opportunities for low-income households. And those are primarily targeted at incomes or households with incomes at, say, 60% of area median income or below. We use tools such as the Land Bank program, the 20-year low-income housing tax exemption, SDC waivers, grants, loans, tax credits, down payment assistance to make affordable housing happen. We recently did the ribbon cutting for Bascom Village, and I don't think we have an image, but I think if you read the RG editorial, I think there was pretty much a strong sense that we do this very well as far as affordable housing. But at the same time, I think it's important to acknowledge that affordable housing is highly subsidized. All the things that I mentioned, free land, SDC waivers, tax exemptions, grants, loans, tax credits, all of those things go into making those projects the success that they are. The other issue is they take time. You know, a project like Bascom Village is a multi-year effort, several years in some cases to bring those forward. So that's not all we do. That we don't only do new construction. We do rental rehab, so we rehab existing stock of housing, either to preserve those affordable units or to bring them from market rate to affordable units through the rehabilitation of those units. We also have home ownership programs, the down payment assistance program that we use. So basically, I won't say we do it all, but generally we cover this full spectrum of kind of affordable housing opportunities. The real issue is resources, and as you recall in our consolidated plan discussions leading up to the adoption of the consolidated plan, we haven't met our goals historically, and the resources that we have for affordable housing have generally flatlined over the years. And I think if you look at a dollar for dollar value and you look at 20 years ago today, we're probably receiving about somewhere in the neighborhood of 50% of what we used to receive for affordable housing. So that's impacted our ability to reach our goals for affordable housing. There is a summary of the affordable housing programs in your packet, and Stephanie Jennings is here if you have any questions regarding the affordable housing programs. There's also transitional emergency housing and the services that are related to the provision of assisting persons experiencing homelessness. However, basically those are things like the car camping program, rest stops, Opportunity Village, the human services fundings. That's all targeted for those specific uses. What we don't yet have is the kind of missing piece of the puzzle, and that's that gap that exists between affordable housing and market rate housing. And that's really what we're here to talk about today. And whether you call it workforce housing, moderate income housing, and recognizing that some of that overlaps with market rate and some of that overlaps with affordable housing, that's really what we're here to talk about today. And the other, I think, important thing is we're not alone. There's a lot of communities across the country that are dealing with this kind of workforce, moderate income housing. There's a lot of communities like Portland and Seattle, San Francisco that really have a housing crisis, and they're trying to address it through affordable housing programs, et cetera. So with that said, I'll hand it over to Ann.
So the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development has programs designed to provide housing to households with incomes at or below 80% of the average median income. The City of Eugene is focused on programs up to 60% of AMI. And these programs are explicitly called affordable housing programs. There's no such programs for workforce housing. The term is used in different communities to mean different things. For example, in resort communities where very high incomes have greatly inflated real estate prices, places like Aspen, Colorado, and Key West, Florida, the term is used to describe housing for individuals that work in the industries that make them resort communities, such as the housekeeping staff and restaurant workers. In other communities, it's used to describe housing for workers who provide essential services to the community, such as teachers and police officers. In those markets, they have experienced exceptional increases in real estate prices and making it difficult for middle-income households to find housing within their budget. The income range that has been used to define workforce housing varies. It often goes down to about 80% of AMI, and it goes as high as 140% of AMI. Some communities define the eligibility using a specific dollar figure and don't reference average median income. Typically, workforce housing covers the population that's generally not eligible for federally subsidized housing, but nonetheless has difficulty finding housing within their budget. Many housing policy experts prefer to avoid the term workforce. The term implicitly suggests that households in affordable housing are not in the workforce, and in affordable housing developments, most of the households with individuals of working age are in the labor force. For example, Westtown on 8th, which is an affordable housing development, is sometimes referred to as workforce housing. Housing policy staff at the City of Eugene have recommended that we use the term moderate income housing. It's a little bit more accurate. Housing is considered affordable when the household spends 30% or less of their income on housing costs. If they spend more than 30%, the household is considered cost burdened. Cost burdened households spend a greater portion of their household income on housing and are unable to put away savings that could be used to buy a home. In some parts of the country, real estate prices have grown very rapidly over the last 20 years, pricing out many middle-income households. The issue is particularly problematic in large coastal cities in California and in Seattle. In these communities, housing costs have grown faster than wages, making it difficult for less affluent households to find affordable housing. We have not conducted an analysis specific to moderate income households in Eugene, so we don't have a precise understanding of the issue. For today's discussion, we pulled together some basic statistics to shed some light on housing affordability. We got a blank slide. We started by reviewing a study commissioned by the City of Seattle. It was completed in 2014, and it focused on programs and policies related to meeting moderate income workforce housing needs in Seattle. That study compared Seattle to 12 other comparable communities, and we used that same sample of cities to provide some context for Eugene. This first chart shows that Eugene's average income is quite a bit lower than that sample of 13 cities, Seattle and the 12 others. They're all major metropolitan areas, and incomes tend to be higher in major metropolitan areas. This next chart shows the median rent for a 2-bedroom apartment, and Eugene's average rent is at the bottom of the list. In San Francisco, its median rent for a 2-bedroom apartment is over $2,000. This quick comparison shows an interesting trend. Relative to those 13 sample communities, Eugene's income is 68% of the average of those 13 communities. Our rent is 77% of the average. And that means that relative to these other communities, our rents are a lot closer to the major metropolitan areas than our incomes are. And this next chart shows what happens when incomes are relatively low and rents are relatively high. It shows the portion of renter households that are cost burdened. And it's hard to see it on the slide here, but you can see it in the hard copy in front of you, that in Eugene, 54% of our renter households are cost burdened, second only to San Diego in that sample. As part of the Lane Livability Consortium, the Community Development Division developed maps that show various statistics about the Eugene area, and this one shows renter cost burden. This is only renter households, not owner households. The dark blue areas are census tracts where over 50% of the households are cost burdened. The light blue show household where between 25 and 50% are cost burdened. The gray show where fewer than 25% of the households are cost burdened. It's hard to find the gray on that map. There's only the area in the northern edge of Santa Clara between Highway 99 and River Road have gray. Otherwise, most of the community has census tracts where over 50% of the households are cost burdened. It's a problem that extends across the community in all parts of town. But again, this is only renter households. One reason that our community has a high portion of cost burden renter households is because our average incomes are low, and our cost of construction is just as high as in larger communities with higher incomes. And therefore, it's difficult for housing developers to build quality housing because expected rents have to be high enough to cover that cost of construction. The issues are complex in Eugene, complex anywhere. In Eugene, the university gives us extra challenges to fully understand housing and income. And one factor is that in Eugene, we have a high portion of our households are renters. 50% of our households are renters. Nationwide, it's 35%. The student population greatly affects that ratio. And the student population has low incomes. Many of the students that are employed earn low wages, they work part-time. But they also have, a lot of them, not all, but some of them have outside resources, such as parents, to help them cover their housing costs. And so the housing near the university commands a much higher rent than the reported income levels would show. And this makes our market particularly complex, and fully understanding how moderate income households are able to afford housing in the community would require an analysis very specific to Eugene. Your packet that you received included a survey of cities that have workforce housing policies. The research staff at the library conducted this research at our request, and they identified 26 cities in the U.S. that have some policy that addresses the issue of housing affordability for moderate income households, and the report also shows a brief description of the policies in those communities. That analysis shows the problem exists across the country and that the policies vary widely. The communities included in the survey are working to address the issue in that community, but because land use policies vary, income structures vary, and land prices vary, the policies vary. This chart shows the factors that affect moderate income housing. The regulatory environment can be a barrier or can be used to enhance opportunities. Market conditions include vacancy rates, income levels and wages, as well as the student population. Financial conditions include land costs and construction costs and interest rates, among many other factors. And we believe that these are the primary factors that need to be understood before we can determine how best to intervene in this issue.
So our overall goal today is to basically plant some starter seeds for discussion, because I think this is going to be a complex issue, to get clearer direction for council as to where we want to go with this, assuming the real question is how can we help bring more moderate income housing into the marketplace, recognizing that we need to dig a lot deeper to understand the marketplace. We need to define our goals. We need to establish policies. We need to consider various tools for intervening into this issue, and recognizing that we also need to be working on the other end of the equation, which is the economic development side that really gets to the wage levels that I think are a really critical part of the overall equation. So.
Got Mike and Claire and Greg, but before that,
I'd like to be in the queue also, Mayor.
Okay, George, gotcha. Seems to me this is a really important time to have this discussion, because when you look at what's happening in other cities right now, and I don't even know what's happening in other university communities, which would be an interesting thing to look at all by itself, is how do we keep a good... We don't even have it yet, but nonetheless, in a lot of places, they've had a pretty good mix of income housing, and they're losing it, and they're forcing people out of certain parts of their communities by the prices being so high. So that's a really challenging issue that's happening across the country. It'd be really nice, and more than nice, it would be important if we could get out in front of this, as opposed to having hit the wall and having to come back from it. So I think in that way, it's very timely discussion, and it's an important discussion about how do we prevent happening to us what happened to others, and how do we actually improve the situation that we find ourselves in terms of affordability of housing. And Mike, you're next.
Thank you, Mayor. 54% of households being cost burdened with their housing. I'm one of them, and I'm here to tell you that I think that is one of the most central issues this community is going to deal with for a very long time. I would like to see, in my perfect world, we would have a comprehensive plan on how we're going to address this central problem, because exactly what you said and showed up there is the important piece, is the difference between income and the cost of housing. Yeah, our housing cost is in San Francisco, but relative to the amount of money people make, it's a huge burden. We're right up there at the top, and it's about that affordability issue. Now, affordable housing and taxpayer subsidized housing is something, in my opinion, we don't need to continue to do as strongly. I think to do that is to exacerbate the problem. What we need to be looking at is how do we incentivize and create the regulatory and the reality of a marketplace and an environment where we're encouraging people the people that do that work, to build homes that people can afford to own, and that we are building places that people can afford to live in without subsidies. That's the part where we get to a healthy community. Now, one of the other pieces of information that's interesting to me is that, well, you said the average community has 35% renters, and we have 50. Yes, that has something to do with the university. However, if you go back into the 90s and look forward, before any of the student housing boom happened at the U of O, you see that we've always been at roughly 50%. The interesting thing is that in the last couple of years, that just in the last 5 years, well, after that housing boom is predominantly finished, we've seen a continual uptick, 1 to 2 points a year, of that percentage of owners versus renters changing. And it's more and more and more renters. So as a city policy, when we say we want to have a much bigger percent of multifamily housing and a much smaller percentage of single-family housing, what we're saying is, since only one multifamily development's happened in the last decade or two that was owned at the Tate, everything else is renters. We're saying we want more renters and we want fewer home ownership. Now, there was a recent MIT study I've mentioned a couple of times, that the surest way and the fastest way to diminish income inequality is through home ownership. I'd like our community to have a policy that we would like to encourage home ownership and affordable homes for workforce housing, whatever you want to call it, and that we're working towards ownership. Put me in the second round, please, ma'am.
Sure. Clear.
Thank you. I really appreciate the presentation. I think your analysis points out exactly the problem, that our median wage are low while our median housing costs are relatively high, only about $100 less than Portland's. And then added to that is the complexity you mentioned of the presence of student renters, which really skews our housing market in a particular way that has a negative impact. And it's not actually connected with any student housing boom, because before there was a student housing boom, all those student renters were out in the community competing with families for rentals. So that's a real thing. Because the university itself doesn't provide enough housing for its own student population. So I'm really interested in what we can do as a city government at the local level to influence these trends. I absolutely agree we need to keep working on ways to increase wages where we are able to influence that. But then I'm interested in what kind of programs we might create as a city. And Denny, you mentioned very briefly the homeowner payment assistance program. Can you speak to that a little bit more?
Actually, I'd like Stephanie to do that if she can.
Okay.
The City of Eugene has for many years provided down payment assistance, and we did it previously using our Home Investment Partnership Program dollars. And we are now doing it through the Community Development Block Grant as part of the consolidated plan approved by Council earlier this year, and the action plan. Council allocated $100,000 for us to restart the program using CDBG funds, and that will support at least 10 home buyers to low-income households to become first-time homeowners. I recognize it's a small number, but it is part of a series of programs underway within the community. We work a great deal with NEDCO, that is both the Regional Homeownership Counseling Center and the Foreclosure Counseling Center. I would say that, like some of these other issues presented, homeownership rates is actually a very complicated issue. Some of it has to do with some of the access to mortgage credit, access to changes in the job market, actually changes in our demographics. We're aging as a community, and so we have some of those things that will impact us as well. And I think if we were to compare our homeownership rates to some other like-size urban areas, you might see something that is a bit closer. That national homeownership rate includes rural areas where you have much, much higher rates of homeownership.
Thank you. So, I don't know if this idea is practical or how much it would help, but I know that we have a low or no interest revolving loan fund that we use to help incentivize new businesses and support new businesses. It's not a subsidy. They have to pay it back. And I wonder if it would make sense for us to explore the idea of that kind of program for homeowners or landlords, property owners who have current rental housing that may have been student housing that they'd like to repurpose to family housing, or in some other way refurbish older rental units that we have. I know HUD has some program for that, but I'm thinking something that we control, that we decide the criteria for, and that we make available to residents in our community. So that's one idea I have. And then I would also, Representative Barnhart at our press conference mentioned repealing the inclusionary zoning prohibition that's currently a state law. I would support that. And just last, I have a couple of quick comment. I was listening to the radio this morning. They were doing a story about San Francisco's housing crisis and old established neighborhoods where folks are seeing their rents go up 3 times what they've been paying, and they just can't stay any longer. And that's partly because of the tech worker boom. We are in a position to experience that same kind of boom depending on what happens with our local economy and the tech sector. And we need a plan. We need to anticipate these market forces. And given the amount of time and effort we put into our land use planning, we should be able to fold this kind of work into that process as well. And lastly, I would like this council to consider adopting an ordinance that would extend the amount of time required to give notice for a no-cause eviction or a rental increase. I know there was some email discussion, not discussion, but just putting forward that idea, and I would be happy to ask for a work session on that to see if we could explore that as one tiny way that we can assist folks who are experiencing rent burden now.
Great.
Now, I'll note that Councilor Syret and I do listen to the same station in the morning. And by the way, in San Francisco, and I looked at the statistics that you had out now, a one-bedroom apartment is averaging $3,000 a month. That was what came out this morning on NPR. So, I think that they're even outpacing your research here in terms of what's going on down there and what's going on in other places around the country. But I want to get back to another point that Mike made in a different way. Can you tell me what are the primary regulatory barriers that we have right now to building what you're calling moderate income housing versus the workforce housing doesn't really exist in a legal framework, but affordable housing / moderate housing? What are those barriers, and how can we be best position ourselves to mitigate those barriers?
And if you recall, that's part of the work that I think that we need to do. I can't answer that because we haven't done that level
Analysis
of deep
yet.
dive yet, but I think that would need to be part of what we look at in addition to demographics and market and tools and all those other things.
And two more questions on the same thing, kind of same issue, going in a different direction. One thing that I note as what I grew up on in the Midwest that doesn't seem to be apparent on the West Coast is that there's a difference in housing stock and the way housing developed. So, my grandparents had what we call the two-family house, where they lived on the bottom and my aunt lived up on the top, and they were just full, basically two-story full-blown houses in one unit. I don't see virtually any of that around here. Mostly it's duplexes and triplexes, if you get that. But there seems to be a reduction in the number of duplexes and triplexes that are being constructed. Is that just an illusion on my part, or is there's some reality behind that? And how can we get to more of that style of housing?
Yeah, I'm not sure, actually. That's a really good question, but that's, again, something we haven't looked at, but that's a really good observation. I'm not sure if it's true or not, to be honest.
Okay, and then kind of the last thing is that what I've been told as far as housing is concerned in this community in regards to redevelopment is that redevelopment is off the table because it's too expensive. Are there tools in either the federal, state, toolboxes that we can access to create a different framework for redevelopment?
All good questions. And this is the kind of work that, again, I think we need to do that we haven't done yet. And that we've spent a lot of time on affordable housing. As you know, we've spent a lot of time on MUPTI, which is a targeted market rate product. We don't have programs right now for this kind of middle gap workforce housing, moderate income housing, and we really haven't done the work yet. And that's kind of what the message is today is if we're going to get into that business, so to speak, we have to do a deeper dive and really figure those things out.
Next up is Alan.
Yeah, good presentation. Thank you for all that info. And I'd like to recognize all the work we've done on affordable housing. That means housing for people at less than 60% of the area median income, or AMI. I'm okay with the definition of 60 to 120% of AMI for workforce housing. That makes sense. And it's pretty inclusive. And this whole issue, though, is part of the middle-class squeeze that's been going on over the last several decades, and they seem to have fallen through the gap here. When we have 54% of our renters that are housing burdens and half of our citizens are renters, this is a big problem, and it's across our entire community, as we saw on the chart. And so I think we need to be thinking about what we can do as a city to help solve this problem and activate parts of the community to get us there. So, the steps to solving a problem are, first, you acknowledge that there's a problem, and then you recognize that you need to come up with a solution, and then you create a plan, and then you implement the plan and allocate the resources towards it. And I thought about putting a work session poll before this about creating a workforce housing plan, but I held off pending this work session. So I think one of the things that I was hoping for out of the outcome of this meeting was that we would acknowledge the problem, recognize we need a solution, and that we ask for a plan. I think we've done the first two, and we haven't done, I think we're ready and should do the third part, which is a plan. In the packet, we've had lots of information summarized about all of the cities that have done stuff around workforce housing and developing programs and policies, and I think that's a good start. But so I would like to move that we direct the city manager to bring back a work plan and schedule for developing a City of Eugene workforce housing plan, including staffing and resources and identification of programs, policies, and legislative actions and incentives that we've all talked about.
Second.
Moved and seconded.
I'd like to be in the queue, Mayor.
On this motion?
Yes, as well as my place in the first
Right.
this round of discussions.
Yep, you're still in that queue, and I'll put you in this one and Mike in this one.
Yeah, I had one more sentence.
Okay.
So just to clarify what I asked for, it's not saying, it's asking the city manager to come back to what it would take to create the plan.
Okay.
I just wanted to make sure we clear.
So that was so then we can see what it would take and what it would look like.
So next up is George Brown.
Okay, now this is on.
Nope, I got to erase that for a minute. Erase that. It is you, George, but we're actually addressing the motion that you made. And George is in the queue and Mike's in the queue. George, go ahead.
Well, I would like Councilor Zelenka to maybe just delay that motion till the end of the discussion, because we haven't really heard from everybody yet, and I've got a few comments that really are directly tied into the intent, what I believe the intent of this motion to be. So I don't know if that's possible, but that would be my suggestion. And the reason is, the whole discussion today is directly tied to finalizing the MUPTI program. I mean, it's very specific. That's why we're having this meeting today, because there were things in the MUPTI ordinance that we hadn't have nailed down yet. And we have a whole series of decision points to move that ahead. And yes, part of it is setting up a working group with staff, and I would suggest 2 or 3 counselors. I want to be one of those counselors and go over the parameters. And so yes, it's not that I object to your motion. I would really appreciate it. In fact, I may even vote for it. But I would rather have the full discussion and save motions for the end of the discussion, personally. Thank you.
Okay, and then I've got in the queue on this one, Mike.
One of the first things I said in round one was that I believe we as a community need to create a comprehensive plan around this, and that's a different sort of thing to only the smallest degree. Your motion asks the manager to come back with what does a plan look like, what it would take, and I'd support that because of that request at first. But I would say that George Brown and I asked for this work session in the first place from our previous work so that we could, A, finish the work around what are the implications for MUPTI, and number 2, then, how do we take a better look at the challenge of creating more workforce housing in the community that's affordable for people to do. And that's the only reason I didn't make the exact same motion in the first round, is because I thought we were going back to having a conversation around this. So I'm happy to support this motion, only recognizing that Alan's saying the same thing that has already been said here about the importance of doing this.
Alan and then Claire.
So I understood the original intent of this motion, and I think there is a workforce housing component in MUPD. The only thing that was missing was the definition, as I recall. Is that right?
We defined
No, there were many other things we're missing too. Sorry for interrupting.
We defined it for in the ordinance that was adopted that put MUPD in downtown boundary, and that definition was basically that 30% of the units needed to meet the 100% AMI affordability threshold. That's for downtown. What was left open-ended is what happens when we expand into other areas of downtown, and that's where you would need to further define how you want to define workforce housing and what percentages when you get to those areas, but we're not to that discussion yet because those areas require refinement, planning, and so forth. And we assume that discussion would happen along with those specific neighborhood kind of refinement plan kind of discussions.
Right, and I understood that it's already in the MUPD program, and that we needed to define it better for the rest of the community if it were to be rolled out. So when I was talking about the staffing and resources, the programs, policies, legislative action, incentives could include MUPD as one of the components to get us towards get more workforce housing, and could be included in the plan. So I wouldn't think that MUPD would be excluded from that plan. I think it would be integral to it, but I think that the workforce housing plan should go beyond that simple tool, which is I think limited.
Claire?
Yeah, thank you. Based on what George had to say, I just wanted to say we can do both. We can adopt Councillor Zelenka's motion, which I think, as he just explained, goes beyond just how we might use the MUPD or how this definition applies to the MUPD, and we can do the work. I'm assuming George has a motion to put out specific to what needs to happen to define these parameters within the MUPD program. So that was all I wanted to add.
Okay, so now I think...
I'd like to make one more comment there.
All right.
I would like to amend Alan's proposal, which I guess I'll go ahead and support. But I would say let's form a working group with staff members and 1, 2, or 3 counselors to affect the intent of Alan's motion. That is a amendment that I'm proposing.
So that's a motion. You put a motion out to amend Alan's motion?
Yes, just to refine it a little bit more, rather than just tell the city manager to work on this whole thing. I think that if we had a working group, we'll have a definition of a working group. Basically, I would like to be part of that work because I've been studying this quite a bit.
Let me see. There's a second. Is there a second?
Okay.
There's no second.
No second.
No second.
Okay.
All right. So now we're back to Mike. You want to speak to this?
Yeah, I wanted to speak to the motion that Alan's got out here, and I want to ask the manager for a little clarification, because I don't know from your perspective. For background, we've created in our community over time several, and I'm going to use the exact words, quote, comprehensive plans to deal with particular things. Do you see what Alan just moved and what we've defined in previous years as a comprehensive plan, not the land use technical comp plan, but a comprehensive plan for how to address an issue? Do you see those as fundamentally different or the same?
Are we trying to nuance words? I'm just trying to get a sense of what
it's important to me before I make a motion to amend that I want to see where you see the level of what he's asking for in this motion. Because if it's not a large-scale community effort to have a conversation on how do we solve this problem, then I want to amend it to make sure that you understand it at that level, at least from my perspective. Because I think this affects most people, a majority of people in our community. I think it's one of the most central issues that we're going to deal with over the next decade, and I think it needs to have that kind of a response from staff. And the only reason I didn't second George's motion is because I don't want to take time having us, who are not experts, argue about it until such a time as there has been sufficient expert research and understanding and several options presented for how we might move on that issue. So I'm asking, how do you understand his motion?
I understand his motion is essentially we're scoping out the study. And then we'll come back to the council with, here's the scope of the work to include what it's going to take, who gets involved in that work, the timing of that work, and any resources required. So what I would suggest is let us do that work first. Mm-hmm. If it comes back that it's too large or not large enough, or you want to have council committees as a part of that, that might be the right time then to add or subtract any of those pieces. So we at least can go do our work. What I think we've heard from you and others, that it's broader than it's not just, this is not a small project.
Right. May I interrupt just to say, if Alan would accept that as a friendly amendment of sorts, that I'm asking for this as what is the scope of doing some manner of very comprehensive plan about what we do about this over the long term. If he'd accept that as a friendly, then I don't need to make any kind of motion or deal with it any further.
I don't understand how that's different than my motion.
Well, that's what I'm asking you. Is it fundamentally different than what I asked for in your understanding?
Whatever the scope is.
So
the scope being one of
this is actually, as John said, bringing back a scope, a work plan and a schedule of what it would take to develop a city plan for workforce housing, including the staffing, the resources, but also, and the only thing I would amend to what you said was the preliminary identification of some programs, policies, legislative actions we might take, incentives that kind of it puts a little bit more meat on the bones than just here's how we would go forward and do the plan.
To finish what I was saying, I would say on a scale as large as some of the most significant comprehensive plans we've created in the community.
Using the ones that are
I would say our standard practice is to involve any numbers of the community in a pretty robust way in most things that we do. So that would be a part of our scoping.
All right, so did you get everything that you wanted to say, John?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. All right, so let's vote on this. All those in favor, please indicate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. George Brown?
I'll vote yes.
7 in favor and none in opposition. It passes. Okay, now we're back to the main discussion. Whatever it is, we're back to. Okay, so George Brown, you're up in the discussion.
All right.
Followed by Chris
Thank you.
and Betty.
Thank you, Mayor. Well, I'll just like to repeat that today's meeting was directly tied to finalizing the MUFTI program, which there's similar sends out there. I'm afraid that this motion may have expanded the scope greatly of the staff work. And I think we need to, and maybe that's what we do need a bigger view. I'm not saying we don't, but I kind of like to wrap up one thing at a time. And in the further examination of the workforce housing requirements and in lieu fees of the MUFTI ordinance, many other things that we'll discover many other things that will relate to Alan's motion. So it seems to me like our first task is to set the range. What do we mean by workforce housing? And I'll just go ahead and use that term. We could be moderate. We could invent our own term if we want to. Workforce housing is the one that's commonly used around the country, and especially by Urban Land Institute. And they suggest 60 to 100% of the definition, 60 to 100% of AMI. That's the workforce. Now, in some higher real estate value cities, it can go up to 100. I think I've seen 180 somewhere. So that's a decision point, and we're not obviously going to make any hard and fast decisions today. That would be for the working group. Do we want to include for sale units or just keep it at rental? Many jurisdictions do both. That's another decision point. If we include for sale, that will be a little bit of complication, but it's doable. Then there's the questions like, can rents go up if the area of median income go up? The rents will be tied to the area median income, so maybe that's a good idea. How long do the workforce housing rents stay in effect? Are they permanent? They are in many jurisdictions. Or do they go away after the 10-year tax exemption? And then the developer could charge anything they want. I had an idea that, like with affordable programs, we could maybe, just for the workforce housing units themselves, maybe we could extend the exemption to 20 years instead of 10 years. Not for all of the units, but just the workforce housing units if they actually get built. That's an idea. Or, let's see, we still need to do a lot of work, I think, on the in lieu formula. And I think that the working group, to help that along at some point, we should drop some. Okay, well, I need another round then.
Okay. Chris?
This is a really interesting conversation, and I'm glad we're having it. And for me, I think we keep kind of touching on the fact that this keeps influencing other things, because what we're really talking about is the cost of living. That's ultimately what it is. What's the cost of living in this community? And we want the cost of living to be a good balance between the income and the expense. And right now, certain elements of that are off. And the cost of living in our community, if it were the destination, we're getting to with this big machine called market conditions. And the market conditions is the transportation vehicle that gets there. And it's got a whole bunch of dials on it. And normally they're self-regulating. A dial for income, a dial for employment, a dial for transportation, and a dial for housing costs. And a dial, then there's many other dials as well. And the dials right now are kind of off. We're running pretty hot. We're running hot because of the thing that says our rental housing burden is running hot. It's too high. And so our market conditions machine is not running right. Some of the dials are off. And so I'm comfortable with us going in and saying we need to tweak some of those dials. We need to make some adjustments. The dial we're talking about right now is the cost of housing dial. The caution I'm having, though, is in this big complex machine, for the most part, it runs itself. And it runs itself because it self-regulates its dials. When one dial gets off, the other dials tend to self-adjust. That's how this market condition machine works. When we go in and we say, we're going to go in and tweak this dial over here, without thinking about the impact on the other dials, what does it do to the machine? Because market condition is a machine that it's there. And I am curious to know how much we can adjust a dial without the other dials having to somehow change to compensate, or the machine breaks down. And so if we want to do something around the cost of housing, I am all for that. I want to tweak that dial. I think that dial's running kind of hot right now. I couldn't agree more. But I'm mindful of the fact it's going to have an effect on some of the other dials. And unless we are conscious of what those dials are and what the impact will be, we could make an adjustment that could break the machine. And I don't mean break it in some catastrophic way, but it may make it run either too hot or too cold or not be right. So I just want to be mindful that there is always a cause and effect. And when we get too focused on one dial, we're losing track of the fact that there's a cause and effect. So I hope that this scope of work that we're talking about will say, yes, it is appropriate for us to talk about affordable housing and mid-income housing. I think it's a great discussion to have. But we shouldn't be so foolish as to think we can just focus in and only talk about that and not worry about the other dials, because they will be affected, and we need to anticipate what that effect will be and what we need to do to influence it.
Thank you. Betty?
Thank you. First, I'm disappointed we aren't going to get to cell towers. I think that was an urgent matter before there are more applications. and this, while it's very important, is not quite as urgent. But I think back to the principle of not doing harm, it's really important that we not facilitate the destruction of what housing we do have that falls into this range. That is, anything we can do to preserve housing that is affordable. And I wish we had never started talking about subsidized housing as affordable housing. It's not the same thing. Affordable is something people can afford to buy without having a subsidy. And I think I would like, one of the best ways you can get to this is inclusionary zoning, which I've been talking about for 19 years now. But soon after I started talking about it, the legislature probably heard me, and they made a law that you can't do it. But I was really glad that Representative Barnhart mentioned this morning that we need to repeal the ban. That's only the first step to getting it, but it's at least a step. And in the meantime, we could try to think of ways to encourage people to build smaller houses with fewer amenities, perhaps. Every house doesn't have to have 2 bathrooms or a thick carpet or a double garage or all the other things that might dishwashers, all the things that might be nice, but there are ways to bring the costs down. And if we could encourage some mixed in with other houses or mixed in with other apartments or other condos or whatever is built, we could do things even without the state lifting the ban on inclusionary zoning. We could do things that might lead to that kind of housing, and I'd like to have ideas about that. As for a 20-year tax break, which was suggested, I think I'd rather do something on the front end. I still believe that everyone should pay taxes. Thank you.
Before I call George Brown and then Alan, in terms of the inclusionary zoning, we have for many years wanted to lift the ban on inclusionary zoning. It's been part of our legislative agenda for many years. And last time we came way far out on it. I think we needed to really look at what happened in the last session. We should be beginning now if we're going to have that come back again. We should begin the work, get in front of it, and use the lessons learned. George Brown.
Thank you, Mayor. Well, we keep kind of getting far afield from the matter at hand, which is kind of finalizing the MUPTI ordinance. And so I know that staff was looking for direction today, and I would suggest that within the parameters of Councilor Zelenka's motion, which I voted for, I think they really ought to stick with trying to get the MUPTI thing nailed down. The sooner we do that, the better. And I realize it will only be a tiny fraction of what the community-wide need is, and yet it's a matter right in front of us, and we can, accomplish that and get it done within, it might take a few months, but I really think we need to go over some of the things that I labeled decision points. And I would like to see head nods. I would like to participate with staff. And unless anyone objects, pardon me?
I said it'd be hard for you to see head nods today.
Well,
are you watching on video?
Yes, it is, because I can't get my computer to. But I will sense them, or maybe someone could tell me if anyone. I guess what I want to know is, would anyone object to 1 or 2 or 3 counselors participating with staff? Because I think it'd be useful. And then come back to council and say a month or 2 months with some parameters to look at and hone it down a little bit more. And then maybe it might even take one more, chunk of time to kind of come up with some final choices for council to vote on, and then they could be plugged into the MUPTI program, and then it's good to go as soon as I think the expansion area would be South Willamette. So, there's not, and that's going to take a while to rework that. So it's not urgent. We don't have to do this by next week, but we want to keep it moving along anyway at a reasonable pace. So that would be my suggested direction for staff. And I think Pasadena has a really successful program. I've been in email communication with Jim Wong, the housing director. And Pasadena, we may want to hire some outside advisors. There are people, Pasadena hired one, and they're advisors in public-private real estate development. They really help them with their in lieu payment formulas and hit a sweet spot where that works for the developers. And, that's what we need to do. So, of course, we have to know where the money would come from. Maybe it could come from the $750,000 that council approved for the 50-year planning horizon. Okay, thank you.
Yep. Alan?
So I'm just wondering, does anyone have any objections to me and one other counselor or two participating with staff in the planning effort?
Next
Are there any objections?
We're in a queue now. People will have the chance to say something if they choose to.
Okay.
Alan?
All right.
Yeah, my problem with just fixing the MUPD or putting it first is it's too small in relationship to the problem. And I believe that the revised MUPD program is going to be much more limited than the previous one in terms of how many units it's going to get and its scope, and won't even come close to result in any of the numbers that we really need to see. So I think MUPD is a very, very small part of what we can do to mobilize workforce housing, which we need to do on a bigger scale. With regard to the comments that you made, Chris, real excellent comments. Markets and market mechanisms are imperfect, and they, especially when they try to solve a social goal or try to achieve a social goal. In this case, the part of the market that's broken is the social equity aspect of affordable housing for those people that fall in that gap between 60 and 120% of AMI. We don't have that housing stock. It's not being built by the market, and that's the problem. And markets often don't fix themselves, and that's when you need an intervention in the marketplace to help achieve those societal goals, being mindful of unintended consequences and when you pull the levers, but we need to put those levers in place and create them to be able to move towards that goal of fixing this problem, including legislative fixes like lifting the ban on inclusionary housing, but also what are the other incentives like MUPD or other things that we can do that other cities have crafted already, and one of the things I would expect us to do is take that list and go back and look at best practices that came out of what we learned and kind of draw from them to then craft our own program, since there's been a lot of work across the country in a lot of different cities towards moving this dial.
Mike?
Thank you, Mayor. While what Chris said before and what Alan just said has some truth in it and has a good deal of truth in it, they're accurate in what they present as the things we ought to look at in order to be able to answer the question, how do we get more of this? There's a piece they left out, or that Alan more precisely left out, and it's what are we doing that we should stop doing that's altering the market? Everybody knows that falsely constricting the amount of land that you have artificially increases the price. I mean, that's basic economics. We're not going to reverse Senate Bill 100 anytime soon. We're going to continue to plan and constrict land intentionally. Aside from that, what other things do we do, and maybe even more specifically in Eugene, that make it more expensive or too expensive or unprofitable for the people who do it to even consider doing it? What are we doing to stand in their way of being able to make a living making houses that actually most of the people would like to either buy or to rent? Thank you.
So, with that, I think we've given you lots and lots of input, and
Actually, it's been very helpful, Mayor. I think, and this whole conversation has actually been really good for us.
I do think it's a really important conversation.
Mayor, just one more thing. This is George. I guess we're about ready to wrap up. Well, I didn't hear any objections to one or more counselors from working
But I don't
attending
think you
meetings
can
with
assume,
staff.
George, I don't think you can assume that. If you want, I mean, you'd have to probably put a motion out, and people would have to vote.
All my suggestion would be is let us come back with the scope, and then it may really make a lot of sense or not, but let us at least know what the scope of the work is, and then we can move forward with something like that, possibly.
Always free to send in some emails, George.
Well, okay. My only reason for suggesting this is I have spent a tremendous amount of time working on this and have a lot more materials than what were included in the packet. If you want to delay it even more, that's fine. It'll just delay the implementation of the update ordinance, and that may or may not be a good thing or a bad thing. So
But I would.
I'll do that. That's fine.
So what I honestly would suggest is that I think that city manager meets with you on a regular basis, and I'm sure Denny would be willing to meet with you too. And so use those opportunities to share the information you have and the suggestions that you have as they go through this process.
Well, I know it's not. I just like to say one brief thing. I know it's not normal procedure for counselors to sit in with staff members and scoping sessions and so on, but I've done so a few times, and the results were beneficial. I mean, the urban animal keeping ordinance and the pesticide-free city property directive and the safe demo protocols, and so they were very productive meetings, actually, I thought. So that's the reason I brought this up.
Thank you, George.
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Alan, and then we're going to
Not actually related to this, but the election ballots are due next Tuesday, November 3rd. So make sure you get your ballots in by Tuesday, 5 p.m.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah, I'm voting twice.
Denny will
Vote early, vote often.
Vote early, vote often.
Early and vote often.
tell everything scheduled as quickly as possible, city manager.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Yes.
And now your music, Alan.